Garrett Voss woke to the smell of burning ozone and the particular metallic taste that suggested his transport pod had just finished atmospheric entry without proper deceleration protocols. This was, he reflected while his vision cleared and his inner ear attempted to remember which direction gravity pulled, a fairly significant deviation from standard xenological survey procedures. The pod's emergency lighting cast everything in amber, which did nothing to improve the view through the transparent upper panel. A sky the color of old bruises, a landscape composed primarily of rocks that had apparently given up on being anything else, and approximately 40 other pods scattered across the landing zone like dice thrown by someone who'd stopped caring about the outcome. He triggered the release mechanism. The pod hissed open, and the atmosphere hit him with the enthusiasm of a half-hearted slap, thin enough to notice, thick enough to breathe, and carrying the distinctive acidity that suggested the local chemistry had opinions about organic compounds. Garrett stood carefully, testing the gravity at roughly 0.8 standard, and conducted a visual survey of his new circumstances with the practiced detachment of someone who'd spent 7 years cataloging agricultural potential on 73 different worlds, most of which had been actively hostile to human biochemistry. The other pods contained, by his count, representatives from at least 19 different species. He recognized most of them from xenological databases, 3 Methodry, whose crystalline bodies caught the dim light and refracted it into confused geometric patterns, a cluster of squelm blob-like beings whose transparent membranes revealed the slow circulation of internal fluids, 7 Vraxed, insectoid creatures with carapaces that gleamed like polished copper, a group of avian Kelros whose feathered crests were pressed flat against their skulls in obvious distress. Others he didn't recognize, which suggested either gaps in his education or that someone had been collecting species from significantly outside the standard trade routes. None of them had exited their pods. This seemed like relevant information. Garrett walked the perimeter of the landing zone, boots crunching on what might have been soil in some previous geological era before it had committed fully to becoming dust. The pods were standard emergency transport models, the kind you'd use if you needed to move breathing cargo without caring particularly much about their comfort. They had life support, basic climate control, and absolutely nothing in the way of long-term supplies. Someone had dumped them here with the bare minimum required to technically classify the action as something other than immediate murder. The planet itself contributed nothing encouraging to his analysis. No visible water, no vegetation, or at least nothing his pattern recognition systems identified as plant-adjacent. Temperature gradients that suggested the nights would be significantly less pleasant than the currently mediocre afternoon. Atmospheric composition that kept hovering right at the edge of breathable without committing to it. And dust. Endless, pervasive, slightly acidic dust that was already coating his clothing and would, given time, coat absolutely everything else, including his lungs. Garrett returned to his pod and began inventorying its contents with the methodical attention of someone who understood that optimism was a luxury, but preparation was simply professional. Nutrient paste for 3 days, water for 2, emergency beacon that had been very deliberately disabled, and various structural components that might be useful if one possessed both imagination and a willingness to repurpose safety equipment into survival tools. The sun, or whatever local star was currently providing insufficient illumination, had progressed noticeably across the sky. Garrett checked his chronometer and ran calculations. 18-hour days possibly, which meant night would arrive in approximately 4 hours. He looked at the other pods, where various species remained in their climate-controlled environments, and made a decision that wasn't particularly dramatic but would, in retrospect, prove foundational. He started building. The pod panels came free with reasonable effort and unreasonable noise. Garrett dragged 3 of them to a rock formation that provided partial wind protection and began constructing a basic windbreak using principles he'd learned on a frozen moon, where the architecture consisted primarily of put something solid between yourself and the thing that wants to kill you. The panels interlocked poorly, and the wind, already picking up as evening approached, found every gap with vindictive precision. He weighted the structure with rocks, sealed gaps with dust mixed with the thick lubricant from the pod's door mechanism, and created something that was, by the most generous possible definition, shelter adjacent. The other species watched. He could see them through their pod windows, crystalline faces pressed to glass, membranous bodies pulsing with what might have been curiosity or possibly just digestive processes. None of them emerged. Temperature dropped 15 degrees in 30 minutes. Garrett had expected this. Atmospheres, this thin-held heat, like a politician held promises, and had prepared accordingly, which meant he'd put on both shirts from his emergency pack and was now considering whether dignity was worth more than warmth. He decided it wasn't, and wrapped the thermal blanket around his shoulders like the universe's least impressive cape. Then he noticed the rocks. Not all rocks, specifically the dark grey ones with metallic striations that he'd been using to weight his shelter. They were warm. Not sun-warmed, that heat had fled the moment the star dipped below the horizon, but genuinely generating their own thermal energy through what appeared to be a slow chemical process. Garrett picked one up, turned it over, and dropped it sharply when it sparked against another rock. Combustible minerals. The planet had combustible minerals. What followed was 40 minutes of experimentation that would have horrified any safety inspector, but produced, eventually, actual fire. The minerals burned with a peculiar green tint and released smoke that probably contained compounds best not inhaled regularly, but they burned hot and steady, and Garrett had lived through enough marginal situations to understand that perfect solutions were the enemy of surviving until tomorrow. He built the fire carefully, using rocks to contain it and metal fragments to reflect heat toward his shelter. The flames cast dancing shadows across the landing zone, and for the first time since the pod had opened, Garrett felt something approximating comfort. Not safety. Comfort and safety were different things entirely, but the basic animal satisfaction of having heat and shelter when the universe was actively trying to take both away. The methodry in the nearest pod pulsed with colors Garrett couldn't interpret. The squeln pressed against their transparent walls. A Kelros tilted its head with the precise angle that suggested acute interest across virtually every species with a head to tilt. Garrett fed more minerals into the fire and didn't invite anyone to join him. He was too busy calculating how long his fuel would last and whether the shelter's orientation would protect against the winds that were now reaching speeds that suggested the night had opinions about his construction project. 3 days established certain fundamental truths about the situation. First, rescue was not imminent, probable, or apparently even considered as a possibility worth planning around. Second, the planet possessed resources. They were simply inconvenient, scattered, and required effort to locate. Third, most species had biological adaptations that made them supremely competent in their native environments and remarkably helpless everywhere else. Garrett spent those 3 days mapping a 5-kilometer radius around the landing zone with the obsessive attention to detail that had made him valuable on survey missions and unpopular at parties. He catalogued rock types, atmospheric variations, elevation changes, and the subtle patterns in dust composition that suggested water had existed here once, possibly even recently on a geological timescale. On the fourth day, he found it a mineral seep in a shallow depression where water condensed from the thin atmosphere and immediately mixed with ground compounds to create a liquid that was technically water in the same sense that poison was technically a beverage. Garrett collected a sample, tested it with the basic chemical kit from his pod, and confirmed that drinking it would solve his dehydration problem by creating several more interesting problems involving kidney function and consciousness. He spent the next 2 days building a solar still. The transparent pod panels, which had seemed useless beyond basic construction, turned out to possess exactly the right properties for condensation collection. Garrett created a sealed system where contaminated water evaporated, condensed on the cool panel surface, and dripped into a collection vessel, leaving the toxic minerals behind. The first version produced 3 ounces of drinkable water in 8 hours. He modified the design, increasing surface area and improving heat retention. The second version produced 8 ounces daily. Other species had noticed the water problem. The Vraxed attempted to extract moisture from rocks using their natural acid secretions, a biologically impressive solution that resulted in 3 cases of chemical poisoning and no actual hydration. The Kelros flew search patterns, looking for standing water, covering impressive distances, but finding nothing their recognition patterns identified as drinkable. One of the squeln, smaller than the others, and moving with the particular desperation that suggested time was running out, oozed from its pod and approached Garrett's camp. The creature stopped at a respectful distance, its membrane pulsing with colors that shifted through the spectrum. Garrett had no idea what this meant. He filled a shallow metal dish with water from his still and placed it between them, then returned to adjusting the still's angle to catch the morning condensation more efficiently. The squeln approached carefully, flowed over the dish's edge, and absorbed the water through its membrane. Its colors shifted to something that resembled blue mixed with gold, and Garrett chose to interpret this as positive. The creature remained near his camp for the rest of the day, not helping but not hindering, simply existing in proximity to the human who had shared half his daily water production without negotiation or apparent expectation of return. The discovery happened on day 16, though Garrett had stopped counting days and started marking time by completed projects and solved problems. He'd been following a discoloration pattern in a ravine system, noting how certain rocks reflected light differently and how dust accumulated in specific patterns that suggested something was affecting local chemistry. He found fungus, not impressive fungus, not the kind that would make xenobiological textbooks or inspire poetry, just a subsurface network growing in mineral-rich pockets where acidic runoff created microenvironments stable enough to support something resembling life. The fungus was dark purple, smelled like decomposition had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and was absolutely definitely toxic. Garrett spent 3 days testing it. He exposed samples to heat, cold, radiation from the local star, and various chemical processes. He cultured it in different mediums, watched how it grew and died, and occasionally did both simultaneously. He tested small amounts on his own skin, watching for reactions. He processed it through fermentation, using bacteria from his own saliva, creating cultures that were probably violating several xenobiological safety protocols. On day 19, he ate a small amount of heat-treated, fermented fungus paste and didn't die. On day 20, he ate a larger amount and experienced only moderate digestive discomfort and the philosophical realization that edible and palatable existed in entirely different categories. By day 22, he had established 3 cultivation patches in the ravine, creating shade structures from pod materials to optimize growth conditions and implementing a rotation system that would theoretically provide continuous harvest. The paste tasted like despair had been mixed with burnt hair and left to ferment in someone's boot, but it contained proteins, carbohydrates, and enough calories to sustain human metabolism at minimal activity levels. The methodry watched his entire process with what Garrett chose to interpret as scientific interest. They didn't need to eat. Their crystalline biology extracted everything required from light and trace atmospheric elements, but they positioned themselves where they could observe his cultivation techniques. One of them, larger than the others with facets that caught light in particularly complex patterns, began pulsing sequences that seemed correlated with atmospheric changes. Garrett started watching for these patterns and discovered they predicted dust storms hours before visible formation. 3 more species emerged from their pods over the following week. They observed Garrett's routines, examined his systems, and either contributed to them or developed parallel solutions adapted to their own biological requirements. Nobody appointed him leader, nobody asked permission to stay, and nobody expected him to solve their problems. They simply recognized that he had developed methods that worked and adjusted accordingly. The storm appeared as a dark line on the horizon 3 days before it arrived. Garrett had experienced dust storms before, had even survived one in an emergency shelter on a desert world, where the winds carried particles that could strip flesh from bone, given sufficient exposure time. This storm looked worse. He abandoned his basic windbreak shelter and began construction in the ravine where the fungus grew. The location provided natural protection, and the substrate was soft enough to excavate while stable enough to hold structural integrity. Garrett dug down approximately 2 meters, creating a semi-underground space that would be protected from direct wind exposure. He shored the walls with the largest pod panels, creating a framework that distributed weight across load-bearing points. The entrance required particular attention, a door seal that could withstand pressure differential without failing, ventilation systems that prevented suffocation without allowing dust infiltration. The engineering problems were substantial. The available materials were limited. Garrett worked through each issue methodically, testing designs, identifying failure points, and implementing solutions that were usually ugly but almost always functional. He created ventilation using hollow struts from the pod frames, implementing a series of baffles that slowed air movement enough for dust to settle before reaching the interior. The door used flexible pod lining material stretched across a rigid frame, sealed with the same lubricant dust mixture he'd used on his first shelter, applied thicker and with significantly more profanity. Other species watched. The Vraxed, with their powerful mandibles and acid secretions, possessed the physical capabilities to assist with excavation. They remained in their pods. The Kelros could have scouted the storm's progression, providing advance warning. They huddled together in a group, their magnetic navigation systems disrupted by something in the planet's geology, disoriented and increasingly desperate. Garrett worked alone, and the shelter was completed 6 hours before the storm arrived. The wind started as a whisper that suggested something larger was coming. Within an hour it was screaming across the landing zone with velocity that sent smaller rocks tumbling and turned dust into a horizontal wall of abrasion. Garrett sealed himself inside the shelter, checked his water supplies and fungus reserves, and waited. The storm lasted 5 days. He emerged to find 2 Vraxed dead from exposure, their carapaces scoured down to the underlayers by wind-driven particles. 3 Kelros lay near his shelter entrance, barely alive, their feathers stripped away and skin abraded to raw flesh. The squeln named Ulam, who had been the first to approach, had attempted to weather the storm in the open and was now dried to near death, its membrane cracked and leaking internal fluids. Garrett carried the Kelross inside first, one at a time, placing them in the coolest corner where they wouldn't overheat from proximity to his body temperature. He collected Ulam carefully, supporting the damaged membrane, and placed the squeln in a shallow depression he filled with water from his still. The creature absorbed it slowly, colors flickering weakly. Then he went back outside and buried the Vraxt in the mineral garden, his term for the fungus cultivation area where organic matter decomposed into useful nutrients. He didn't lecture, didn't explain what they should have done differently, didn't point out that his shelter had held while their pods had not. He simply expanded the entrance to make it accessible for different body configurations, placed water containers outside with crude symbols scratched into stone, indicating availability, and set up a fungus cultivation station with visual instructions showing heat treatment and fermentation processes. The invitation was implicit, and over the next 3 days it was accepted. The Kelross entered first, moving carefully on damaged wings, bringing nothing but their exhausted bodies and the kind of desperation that bypassed pride entirely. Garrett showed them where water was stored, demonstrated how the still functioned, and returned to his routines without ceremony. A methodry, he mentally designated quecks based on a particularly distinctive light pattern, approached next, pulsing colors that seemed interrogative. Garrett responded by sharing his mapping data, metal plates scratched with topographical information and resource locations. Quex stationed itself where it could photosynthesize while remaining near the shelter entrance, and began pulsing atmospheric warnings with increased frequency and detail. 5 Squiln arrived as a coordinated group, moving with a collective purpose that suggested they'd been planning. They positioned themselves around a large pod section and began the slow process of moving it toward the shelter. Garrett watched, realized they were contributing to expansion efforts, and adjusted his construction plans to incorporate their addition. A Vraxt named Chekka, the designation derived from the clicking sound it made, approached with what Garrett recognized as samples, different rocks, minerals, unusual dust formations. The creature possessed the ability to analyze chemical composition through taste and secretion reactions, providing information that would have required laboratory equipment. Garrett shared his cultivation techniques. Chekka contributed mineral analysis, identifying which rocks could be processed for nutrients and which would poison anything that attempted consumption. This wasn't leadership. The narrator would note if narrators could explicitly note things, and it wasn't submission. It was recognition of method. Garrett had demonstrated that problems could be solved through observation, experimentation, and systematic effort. Others recognized this framework and adapted it to their own capabilities. The settlement developed organically around complementary abilities rather than hierarchical structures. Garrett maintained his routines: morning water collection and still maintenance, afternoon fungus cultivation and expansion, evening shelter reinforcement and tool creation. Others developed parallel schedules adapted to their biological requirements and natural capabilities. Methodry positioned themselves to maximize light collection, their crystalline bodies becoming living solar collectors that could also serve as light sources during the long nights. They began pulsing increasingly complex patterns that correlated with atmospheric pressure changes, temperature shifts, and dust storm formation. Garrett started checking these patterns before planning any expedition beyond the immediate settlement area. Squiln, who detected ground vibrations through their entire bodies, established a network around the perimeter. They couldn't communicate verbally, but they could pulse colors in coordinated patterns that served as early warning for seismic activity or approaching storms. 3 times they alerted the settlement to dust storms before any visual confirmation was possible, providing hours of additional preparation time. Kelros, once Garrett created magnetic markers from iron-rich rocks arranged in specific patterns, rediscovered their navigation abilities. They began aerial resource mapping, covering distances impossible for ground-based species and identifying water seeps, mineral deposits, and fungus colonies scattered across the region. They couldn't carry supplies, their bodies weren't structured for load-bearing, but their information made resource collection significantly more efficient. Vraxt excavated new chambers using their acid secretions, expanding livable space and creating storage areas for water and food reserves. Their digging uncovered a new fungus variety, this one less toxic and marginally more palatable, growing in deeper mineral layers. Garrett tested it using his established protocols, confirmed it was edible, and added it to the cultivation rotation. The settlement grew not through grand planning, but through accumulated small improvements. A better water still design, a more efficient fungus fermentation process, structural reinforcements that reduced maintenance requirements. Each species contributed what they could when they could, and the settlement became more resilient, not because anyone commanded it, but because everyone participating recognized that their survival was interconnected. Not everyone joined. 7 species remained in their pods, either biologically incompatible with the planet's conditions or psychologically frozen by abandonment. Garrett didn't pressure them. He ensured water reached their pods, placed fungus paste in accessible containers nearby, and marked locations clearly with symbols that were, if not universal, at least geometrically obvious. When a squiln died inside its pod from environmental system failure, Garrett and Orlam buried it in the mineral garden. The creature's body would decompose, providing nutrients for fungus growth, which would feed other species which would continue living. It was pragmatic rather than poetic, but pragmatism had kept them alive when poetry would have starved. Some species were waiting, Garrett understood, for rescue or authority, or someone to provide solutions rather than frameworks for developing solutions. Others, like the gelatinous frel, were simply biologically incompatible with the environment's temperature extremes and atmospheric composition. Their pods kept them alive, and Garrett left supply stations nearby, marked clearly, checked regularly. 3 species eventually emerged quietly over the following weeks, integrated without announcement, and contributed to systems already functioning. They neither apologized for delaying nor explained their hesitation. Garrett neither welcomed them explicitly nor treated them differently than anyone else. They simply became part of the routines that structured daily survival. On day 68, Garrett found vegetation, not fungus, actual photosynthetic plants growing in a deep canyon system 5 kilometers from the settlement. They were primitive, hardy things with thick, waxy leaves and root systems that penetrated deep into rock fractures where trace water collected. They produced small seed pods that were, after processing to remove natural toxins, genuinely edible and moderately nutritious. He returned to the settlement with samples, and for the first time since landing, something resembling excitement spread through the group. Quex used light analysis to determine optimal growth wavelengths. Cheek Cake tested soil composition and mineral requirements. Squelm carefully transported seeds, their soft bodies protecting delicate structures better than any container. Kelros scouted for similar canyon systems, locating 3 additional sites within exploration range. Garrett coordinated not through commands but through information sharing and demonstration. He showed cultivation techniques adapted from agricultural methods used on 17 different worlds. Others adapted these techniques to local conditions and their own capabilities. Within a month, They had established cultivation operations in 3 canyon systems, and food scarcity transitioned from immediate crisis to manageable logistical problem. The settlement had become something more permanent than survival camp, but less formal than colony. Nobody had named it. Nobody had established governance structures or assigned official roles. They simply existed as a collection of beings who had recognized that cooperation produced better outcomes than isolation, and who maintained that cooperation through consistent routines rather than enforced hierarchies. 6 months after abandonment, a ship appeared in orbit. The settlement gathered in the open area where pods had first landed, now cleared of debris and marked with the geometric patterns that had become navigational references. Some species displayed obvious relief, others hesitation. The Kelros chirped excitedly, already imagining return to worlds with proper magnetic fields. Several Squelm pulsed colors that suggested eagerness to leave. The Methodry remained neutral, their crystalline faces impossible to read. Garrett stood outside the shelter network, which now extended across 3 interconnected chamber systems with proper ventilation, water recycling, and food storage. He'd built it assuming permanence because assuming anything else seemed presumptuous when the universe had already demonstrated its indifference to expectations. The ship sent a probe, standard reconnaissance procedure. It transmitted requests for identification and status updates. Garrett considered the ruins of 40 pods scattered across the landing zone, the 2 burial sites in the mineral garden, and the functioning settlement that had emerged not despite abandonment, but possibly because of it. He walked to the fire pit, now a permanent structure rather than desperate improvisation, and added combustible minerals. The flames caught quickly, green-tinged and hot, sending smoke signals into the thin atmosphere. The same fire that had started everything, now serving as beacon for whatever came next. Garrett watched the probe descend and felt neither desperate gratitude nor particular concern. If rescue had arrived, they would adapt to that. If something else had found them, they would adapt to that too. Adaptation was simply what they did now, what they had learned to do in the specific way that beings learned things when survival required observation, patience, and systematic problem-solving rather than waiting for solutions to arrive from elsewhere. The probe landed, and Garrett waited to see what happened next, ready to face it exactly as he had faced everything since that first moment when the pod opened, and he stepped out alone into a dead world that had turned out to be only mostly dead, and perhaps not even mostly, and definitely not permanent in its hostility to those willing to build fires and cultivate fungus and construct shelters against storms that would inevitably pass.